Thank you very much. It's really great to be with all of you this morning. Actually, 5.5 years ago, as was mentioned, I had a routine doctor's visit, and I went back to my office, and then I got a call from my doctor, and she said, "You've got 30% blasts in your blood. If you come right back to UCLA, they'll do a bone marrow." Now, I'm a surgeon. I don't think about blood except when it spills on the floor. Um, but not what's in it. And so I'm driving back thinking, blasts, what the hell are blasts? And I had the bone marrow biopsy, and I said to the medical oncologist, who was not very forthcoming, I said, "Well, so when will the results be available?" This was Thursday. And he said, "Oh, probably next week sometime." And I said, "Bullshit, the slides are out tomorrow. Look at it yourself and call me." Well, I had acute myeloid leukemia, which is not the good kind, AML. And my wife was out of town. I got online and looked it up, and I found out it really wasn't good, and the treatment was going to be even worse. And within a week, I was in City of Hope, where I spent the next 13 weeks. I got to experience chemotherapy firsthand, which was not fun, and basically was completely out of it for the last month or two. Thanks to my baby sister's bone marrow, my family, my friends, and good medical care, today I'm celebrating my 70th birthday. Talk about being born again. You literally change your blood type, and you lose your allergies, and you get the allergies of your donor. So I used to be allergic to nickel, and I couldn't wear cheap jewelry, and now I can. It's great. But if I had gotten the bone marrow from my brother, because they don't care about the gender so much as they do the immune markers, then my blood would have XY chromosomes, and the rest of me would be XX. So I could do crimes, and they would never know who to look for. I'm really a true chimera. But that experience really required all the resilience that I could muster, and you never really recover. You never fully recover. You know, as a physician and medical professionals, we talk about, the side effects of treatment. But side effects are temporary. Side effects are throwing up when you get chemo. They don't last forever. But the chemo brain, that does last forever. It's sort of like having your car in a car crash and then having it fixed. The passenger door never quite closes the same way again, even though it's fixed. And that's how your body is after going through this experience. And we haven't really paid very much attention to it, because generally in cancer we've thought much more about saving lives and keeping the person alive, and not very much about the long-term consequences afterwards. And so that's one of the things that I learned, and that I'm trying and working harder on, as you'll see at the foundation, because I think it's all well and good to save people, but if their life is really miserable, then you're not really doing them very much. I ended up not only with the chemo brain, but you lost all taste and smell, which is really not very much fun, because the chemo poisons the nerves as well. And I became a vegetarian because it's much more interesting textures and colors than meat is. If you can't taste it, meat is really boring. But you really have to have resilience. You have to let go of your before self, and you have to accept the new normal. Luckily, I've had a lot of experience reinventing myself. I started out in New Jersey as the oldest of 5, and went to grammar school there, but then we moved to Puerto Rico, where I went to middle school. So I went from mooning over the Beatles and doing the twist to having my mother have to come to the dances to chaperone us. It was a very, very different culture. Then we went to high school in Mexico City, where I pursued my love of science and did research in the basement on frogs with my in Mexico, you could just buy the frogs, or you could buy the ether, and you could just do it. It was great. And I had my siblings there assisting me, so I became a surgeon very, very early. I decided that the high school needed a science fair because they didn't have one. So I started it. I picked the judges. I picked the prize, and I won. It's one way to be resilient. I went on to college at Notre Dame of Maryland, and then I finished at Fordham, attending my junior year at Fordham in a habit, because I had decided at that point that I was going to save the world by being a nun. It was right after Vatican II, and nobody quite knew what was going on in the convent or anywhere else. And but I did wear a habit, and then I was a smoker then, and I gave up smoking practically every night. And then I would sneak in my habit and buy another pack, and then be in the top of the convent, sort of smoking and throwing it away. Well, I kicked the habit, and I ended up being the first one in my family to finish college. I decided then to go to medical school, which really my mother was not very happy about. She wanted me to marry a doctor, not to be one. And I did, but not the way she thought. Unfortunately, there wasn't much appetite at the time for women in medicine. The schools, the medical schools and the law schools all had quotas. 5 to 10% could be women. And what really happened was this was 70, but in 72, Title IX said, if you take federal money, you can't discriminate. And so the first schools that went down it wasn't about sports, were the law schools and the medical schools. So in 72, they had to get rid of their quotas. And then later on, somebody said, hey, we could apply this to sports too, and took it further. But there really were hardly any women, and you obviously had to be better than the guys. I fell in love with surgery, but the chief of surgery said when I walked in, he met with everybody who got honors or failed. And I walked in and he said, so you failed? And I said, no, actually, I got honors. He said, well, women shouldn't be surgeons anyway. And that was the end of that interview. It was a difficult time. Luckily, I did get into a training program in Boston, which was very liberal because they took 2 or 3 women as opposed to one. And was able to start. But people would ask you in the interviews things like, what kind of birth control do you use? And that was Columbia. I said, sorry, my job is to decide my personal life. Your job is to decide if I'll be a good surgeon. Or at the Brigham, they said, how will you operate when you're pregnant? And I said, even pregnant, my belly will be smaller than some of your surgeons. Needless to say, I didn't get into either one. It was not, we needed a Me Too movement during residency, and we didn't have it. So it was not unusual to be scrubbing and then have, and sterile, and then have somebody come behind you and run their hand down your butt. Or to walk into the operating room ready to go, and the anesthesiologist would say, is the surgeon here yet? And it just went on and on. I finished, and I was chief resident, which is supposed to be the highest thing, and nobody offered me a job. So I hung up a shingle and set up a practice and waited. And in fact, I started getting patients, mostly women and mostly with breast problems. And it was just around the time when we had more data about breast cancer, that you maybe didn't always have to do a full mastectomy, that maybe there are other ways to deal with things, that you didn't have to do the one stage. I mean, when I started, you went to sleep for a biopsy not knowing whether you would wake up with your breast or not, because they did a biopsy and an immediate mastectomy. And the way you found out was when you got to the recovery room, you'd be bandaged either way. So you looked at the clock, and if it was only an hour, it was benign. And if it was 2 or 3, you had cancer. It was terrible. And so all of a sudden, all these women started coming to see me because I would explain things to them, God forbid, and we would do it in 2 steps. And it made a huge difference. The other surgeons just really couldn't figure out why I was so popular. And one of them actually said that what I did was I asked them what he had told them, and then I told them the opposite, and that's how I stole all his patients. But not because he was wrong, but because I was just obstinate. The other thing they said was that it was the mauve carpets, that because my office had mauve carpets, that was why we were more popular. It was crazy. And, not surprisingly during this time, another thing they had was for the operating room, they had a nurse's changing room and a surgeon's changing room. The nurse's changing room had one toilet, no shower, half lockers, and was quite small. The surgeon's changing room had 3 toilets, 3 showers, long lockers, and a separate lounge where they served coffee and pastries. Okay, so one day I said, "To hell with this," and I just walked into the surgeon's lounge, and there was one of the fellow attendants in his underwear, and I said, "Oh, excuse me, I didn't know this was the men's room. I thought it was the surgeon's lounge." Needless to say, when they renovated the building, they had the men's room and the women's room. It took them a while to figure out. Although I was in practice and working hard and realizing that, in fact, there were things that were missing. And I didn't have much of a personal life, and I decided to go on a Find a Man campaign. So I put ads out in the old way, before there was any of the online stuff. And I found a man, but I found out that wasn't really what I wanted. And I ended up falling in love with another woman surgeon. And we soon moved in together. And so that was the beginning. And shortly thereafter, the Boston Globe decided that it was going to do an article about my practice. And they brought me out. So I came out in headlines in the Boston Globe, and I figured now that's going to be really bad. But it turned out that it was great, because my patients, a lot of them came in, and they had daughters or sons that were gay. One patient came in and said that her son, who lived in California, had called her and hadn't called her in a long time because he was afraid to tell her he was gay. And when he saw the article about me, he realized she'd be okay. So it taught me that being yourself and being out and living your life out loud, at least for me, has always been beneficial. When you start not being who you are, you only get yourself into trouble and other people into trouble. And it just isn't worth the pain and hard work of doing it. It's much easier just to be who you are once and for all. After several years, my wife and I decided we wanted to have a kid. Now, this was a long time ago. It wasn't that easy, but we're doctors, so we knew how to do it. And we tried first with my brother and my wife getting pregnant, and she didn't get pregnant. And he's gotten a lot of people pregnant, actually, so we know it wasn't him. And then we switched, and her cousin, who lived in California and was single, he was a high school teacher, agreed to donate, because we wanted our daughter to be related to both of us. And he shipped frozen sperm across the country, and we knew where to put it. And I got pregnant right away. It's beneficial to be Irish Catholic. I mean, even when you're gay. You're fertile. And our daughter's now 30, actually, and she's getting married to her girlfriend next fall. It was difficult to balance 2 surgical practices and a kid, but she was well worth it, and we had a great time. And we ended up, it's interesting, because in order to put a man's name on a birth certificate that you're not married to, you have to have a notarized letter acknowledging paternity. Because you know how we women are. We would just put any old guy's name on there. And so we had to get the notarized letter, because I didn't think she should have a birth certificate that said unknown when we actually did know. And then we realized that my wife had no rights, no legal rights at all, to Kate, even though she was raising her from the beginning. So we decided, and we sued the state of Massachusetts for her to be able to be a co-parent. And to do that, we had to then get our daughter's father to take his name, to renounce his paternity, having gotten him to do it. And then, and I had to give up my rights as well. And then we had to adopt her together as a couple. And that went to the Supreme Court of Massachusetts and set the stage for gay marriage as well, because they had already approved that you could do that. The lesson is, don't take no for an answer. You know, and if the world's not what you want, change it. It was about that time that I also wrote the first edition of the breast book, and they called it Dr. Susan Love's Breast Book, because they said, we want everybody to know that a woman wrote it, that it's a doctor, and we don't want the word cancer in the title. So this was marketing in the old days. It's now been through 6 editions and over 30 years, and I sort of call it Dr. Susan Love's, especially when I'm writing, Dr. Susan Love's goddamn breast book, but we won't go there. The book also initiated the politicization of breast cancer. The AIDS movement had demonstrated that people with the disease could make a big difference in terms of funding and research, and women with breast cancer took notice. And so I was in Salt Lake City giving a talk in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, about breast cancer, and I was even getting a little bit tired of it myself. And I looked down and I said, you know, I don't know what it's going to take to get more breast cancer research money. And George Bush Sr. now was in the White House. I said, maybe we should march topless on the White House. And they came up to me and said, when do we leave? I said, that's what we've got. Timing is everything. That was the beginning. One called Boston February day. UCLA called me and said, was I movable? And I looked out the window and I said, sure. And that was a time when everybody was saying women aren't asking for enough money. They never asked for enough. So I figured out what it would cost for us to move out here, for my wife not to work, to buy the same kind of house that we had in Boston. I did all that, and because I wasn't really looking, and amazingly, they gave it to me. We even got our daughter into UES. So the lesson is, don't sell yourself short. If you don't ask, you definitely won't get it. So ask for what you really think you deserve, and then you can decide if you want to settle, but at least ask for what you need and what you deserve. We set up the Multidisciplinary Breast Center at UCLA and gave every woman a tape recorder to tape her visit, and then had them seen by surgeons, radiation therapists, and oncologists all at once, and it was highly successful. But by the time my 5-year guarantee was up, they were really annoyed and tired of me causing all these problems. And luckily, at that same time, I had just gotten an advance to write a book about hormone replacement therapy and how we shouldn't put a whole generation of women on drugs until we had science to back it up. And so I had a big advance, and I came to the Anderson School and got an MBA. At that time, I was interviewed by Malcolm Gladwell. He was young then and not quite as famous, but the title of the article in the New Yorker in big print and across the cover was, "How Wrong is Susan Love?" Because I was saying we shouldn't put everybody on hormones. And of course, the Women's Health Initiative, which was run by Bernadine Healy, the only time we've had a woman head of the NIH, showed that hormone replacement therapy wasn't safe to take over long term, and that it was natural to go through menopause. So when that happened, some of my friends wrote him and said, "Are you going to apologize?" And he said, "No," but he'd learned not to be so dismissive. You just have to say what's right. You know, they can't, and the great thing about being an outsider is they can't hurt you very much that way. So at any rate, my goal has been to change the world, and my father said that you should make the world a better place for having been there. I started 3 companies after Anderson. It was the internet craze. I had an internet site and 2 medical device companies. One of them made money, the other one didn't, but it made money in a bad way. to me anyway. It's a way of looking at the fluid in the breast to see if, almost like a pap smear, to look for early changes of breast cancer. And it was bought by a mammography company that was threatened and killed it. So it was a success. Everybody made money, the investors made money from a business standpoint, but from my standpoint, it was a failure. And I said, I can't deal with that. And I changed my focus to my nonprofit. And so I started the Dr. Susan Love Research Foundation, where I'm the chief visionary officer, which sort of fits my role in life. I may not be good at the details, but I always have the vision. And our mission is to end breast cancer. My frustration was that all the research goes on in rats and mice. Most of the research down in the south part of the campus, because they're easier, they're cheaper, and they get results faster. And then you can get your papers written. But the problem is rats and mice don't get breast cancer. We're the only ones that get breast cancer. Humans and macaque monkeys, and that's it. So if we do research on rats and mice, we'll be really good at curing artificial breast cancer in rats and mice, but we won't help women. And when I asked my friends that were researchers about it, they said, well, we don't know how to find women. I said, well, I do. So that was why we started the Army of Women. And the Army of Women is, 10 years ago actually, is a big, it sounds fancier than it is, because it's a big mailing list, email list. And you sign up, and you can sign up at www.armyofwomen.org. And please do, because we need more people and more diversity. And then and you're signing up to hear about studies that are being done on women and that need women. And researchers come to us, we vet their research, and if it looks reasonable, then we send it out. And we send all studies out to everybody, because you may not fit the study, but your sister who lives in Kansas may be perfect. And so if we send it to everybody, it virally gets out further. And it's been a huge success, both at getting more research done and at educating people about what research is being done. And so I encourage you to please join. We need many more young women. We need women of color. We need all ethnicities. If we're not all part of the research, then the research won't apply to all of us. So we really have to raise our hands and be part of it. Our focus at the foundation is to do the research that nobody else is doing. So we're trying to understand women's breasts. Now, the breast is really an amazing, resilient organ. It's the only one we're not born with. Think about it. You're born with a nipple and little stem cells behind the nipple. It reminds me of those little sponge animals in a capsule, and you put them in water and then they, turned into something. Well, that's sort of what our breasts are like. They're sitting there at the ready, and then when the hormones come at puberty, whoa, there we go. The ducts grow back and we have breasts, and then every month they're at the ready. Is this going to be the month? No. How about this month? Nah. Maybe that month? No. And so they keep trying, and then you get pregnant. And then they turn into a milk factory. Then they turn blood into milk. That's really pretty magical when you think about it. And the milk changes. The milk for a newborn is different than the milk for a 9-month-old. And it also gives them the microbiome, it gives them their immune system through that milk. And then at the end of breastfeeding, massive cleanup, massive involution, everything, all the ducts get cleaned up, and then you make new ones for the next kid. And you keep doing that until you go to menopause, and then they get to retire. So there's no other organ in our body that goes through so many changes than the breast does. Really, and yet we know very little about it. We don't know how many holes there are in the nipple. We did one study when I was here at UCLA. We went to La Leche League and we counted, and we think it's about 6 to 8, but actually we haven't proven that. We don't know where the anatomy of the ducts are. We know the anatomy of everything else, the liver, the kidney, everything, but not the breast ducts. Now, we have a little scope. You could actually thread down a duct and look around, but the problem is we don't have a map. And so you need a Waze for the breast, or a Google map, so that you could find out where the early changes are and zap them, and then you probably wouldn't have to do surgery or take breasts off. So we're working on that. We took, my latest great idea was to take women who were breastfeeding, because then they have milk in their breasts, and do whole breast 3D ultrasound, because then you could see the milk would be like a contrast material. Well, we did 10 women. We had them bring their babies. We did the ultrasounds. They were very complicated, and we had trouble first analyzing them. So we went to the Jet Propulsion Lab, actually, who are helping us. They're very good at fuzzy images. The problem is you can't say to them, you can't say nipple or breast, and you can't, God forbid, you touch yourself. They're under the table. They're these nerdy guys. They like to pretend breasts aren't there. But if you say, map those lakes in that mountain, they're really good. Then they're fine. So we found, though, interestingly, that not all the ducks are making milk. This was a big surprise to me. We always said that all the ducks make milk, and then if you have twins, they make more milk, or if the kid's bigger, you make more. No, you start in the lower outer, and then if you need more, you recruit more ducks. And the last duck that gets pulled into action is the upper outer. Now, the reason that's so interesting is that's the duck that gets the most cancer. Maybe that's why you have to breastfeed at least 9 months to get protection or a decreased risk of breast cancer, because maybe you haven't used that duct, and therefore it doesn't clean up afterwards and involute. I don't know. We're now going to try to get industrial strength breastfeeders that are 9 to 12 months and do whole breast ultrasound on them and see if we can get a better map. So stay tuned about that. We're also looking at the microbiome of the breast. Human Microbiome Project. They didn't do the breast. They were boys. They didn't do it. They did every other organ, and they didn't do the breast. The breast gets sucked on by Tom, Dick, and Harry, and Mary, and everybody else. You know it's got bacteria and viruses in it. It just never occurred to them. So now we've done one study that shows there might be a protective bacteria. And if you were Mother Nature, you might want somebody who had a kid and breastfed to live, so maybe you would have a protective bacteria that would decrease your risk of breast cancer. And we're working on that, doing some further work on that as well. But it shows you why you need to have women doing some of the research. Because it's not that the men are evil, it's just that it doesn't occur to them because they haven't had the experience. Our biggest project is an NIH-funded one to develop a self-reading ultrasound. So in most places, breast cancer is in premenopausal women in most low to middle income countries, and most of the time it's going to be a lump, not because mammograms don't work as well in the younger population. But most lumps are benign. So if you could easily figure out, triage, who's benign and who isn't, then you could have scarce resources on the ones that need it. So this is an ultrasound. It looks like an old flip phone. GE lent it to us. And you hold it over the lump 2 ways, and you get a red light or a green light. And so then the ones that are clearly benign don't have to do anything, and the ones that might be suspicious do. In Guadalajara, where we're testing this right now, it's a 9-month wait for a diagnostic ultrasound because they don't have enough radiologists. So if we could get this, and then the GE said to me, but who would be the customer in the United States? And I said, Planned Parenthood, the community clinics, all kinds of places. Not to mention the military, who's got women out in the field, and if they that are premenopausal, and if they get a lump, you don't want to have to bring them all the way back. There's lots of things. So we're working on that one now as well. So the great thing about having your own foundation is you can really do whatever you want. As long as you can get people to pay for it, it's fine. And you can do whatever you want, too. You don't have to have a near-death experience to reinvent yourself and do great things. You can get out there and do something incredible right now. And the worst thing that'll happen is you'll fail. Oh, well, dust yourself off, get up, and try something else, or do it again. Failing is not the worst thing, and you'll learn a lot. You, by your very biology, are resilient. You're resilient just the way the breast is, just the way our bodies are. We can't deny it. We are resilient. And so, therefore, we've got a we don't have to do it the way the boys do. We can do it our way. We can make the world a better place for both them and us by doing it and not having to stay on the same rules. Life is about living, trying, failing, and sometimes winning. Life is about resilience. Go for it. Your time is now. Thank you. Thank you.